Each fall, millions of hunters venture into the American wilderness in pursuit of wild game. Some return successful, others empty-handed, and some not at all. These are the stories of 4 different hunters who never made it home to their families, having fallen victim either to natural perils or the greatest danger of all, other humans. Now, investigators must track through the backwoods in search of answers far more elusive than any prey. These little-known cases are in critical need of tips from the public, so join us as we explore the stories of multiple victims in this special multi-case episode of Last Seen Alive. Cases covered in this episode include the unsolved 2001 murder of James Southworth, a Wisconsin man who was ambushed by a cruel killer while hunting alone on family property. The unsolved 2005 murder of Pennsylvania hunter Steve Kachanik, who was gunned down months after narrowly avoiding a deadly trap someone had set for him in the same woods. The unsolved 2016 murder of Terry Brisk, who was fatally shot at close range with his own deer rifle while hunting on his family's property in Minnesota. And the unsolved 2022 disappearance of Steve Keel, an avid outdoorsman who vanished without a trace just outside of camp during an Alaskan hunting trip. Thanks for listening to Last Seen Alive. I'm your host, Leah, crime analyst by day and true crime storyteller by night.
And as always, I'm your co-host, Scott.
This is our 4th multi-case episode of the year. As a reminder, we planned 4 total, with 1 airing in each quarter of 2024, so this is the final one for the year. Of course, we're still airing our regular single-case episodes every other Monday. Nothing has changed in that regard. These multi-case episodes are something extra and have allowed us to cover a dozen extra little-known cases over the course of 2024. Each of the stories in these episodes will be a little shorter than the cases we cover in our regular episodes, and that's simply because there isn't as much information out there on these cases. These are cases that are, by and large, underreported upon and relatively unknown outside of the localities in which they occurred. So please, if you have any information on any of these cases, let investigators know. We'll include contact information for the appropriate investigating agencies at the conclusion of each story, as usual. And now, on to our first story. James Southworth was last seen alive on November 23, 2001. He was 37 years old and lived in Clark County, Wisconsin, with his wife, Janice, and their 2 kids, a 4-year-old daughter and 7-year-old son. James had a good and very Wisconsinite job as the president of a cheese processing facility.
You know my love of agriculture. You know how much I just love farming in general, and that is such a vital piece of the process. It's such a cool job, I think.
Who wouldn't want to be president of a cheese processing facility? It was a good job. He had a good life. When James wasn't at work, he often spent time with his family, his wife, kids, and his parents who lived nearby. He was a family man and, especially when fall rolled around, an avid outdoorsman. His parents owned a 160-acre, or approximately 65-hectare, plot of land in Clark County, which is located in the central part of the state and is largely rural. Specifically, the land was located in Lynn, which is a very small town of less than 1,000 people. James knew his parents' plot of land exceedingly well. He'd been hunting it for many years, literally his entire life. His dad would tell the Journal-Times, quote, "James knew the land. He knew hunting probably better than anyone I know. It was his first love. He was no novice in the woods," end quote. So when James laid his plans to hunt on a holiday weekend in late November of 2001, shortly after the opening of firearms deer hunting season, it was all very routine. Thanksgiving fell on the 22nd that year, and he'd spent the day celebrating with his family. The following day, the 23rd, he took advantage of having a Friday off of work and set off into those 160 familiar, family-owned acres. And for the first time in a lifetime of retreating into those woods, he didn't return. We don't know much about what happened after he arrived there, but here's the little bit that we do know. When James arrived, he parked his pickup truck and walked toward a tree stand that he'd previously set up at a certain spot. We know he climbed up into the tree stand to hunt because a relative who lived nearby, a cousin of his mom's, passed by and saw him sitting in it. That was at about 4 p.m, according to an article published in the Chippewa Herald. When darkness fell and James failed to return home, his wife Janice called his cell phone. When he didn't answer, she grew concerned enough to call their nearby relatives with whom they'd enjoyed Thanksgiving dinner just the day before and assemble a search party. They all proceeded to the family plot of land and began searching, combing through the woods with flashlights. A cold rain began to fall when they searched, but they were undeterred. They knew that something, some sort of accident or maybe a medical event like a heart attack, had to have happened to James. Otherwise, he would have come home, or at the very least answered Janice's call. Speaking of calls, James's family also reached out to the local sheriff's department, and a deputy responded to the location to aid them in their search. According to that Chippewa Herald article, he used his patrol vehicle's loudspeaker system in order to repeatedly call James's name. However, he received no response. By the time the sun rose, James still hadn't been found. However, reinforcements, more volunteer searchers from the local community, had arrived. And with their help, plus daylight, James was finally located. Searchers found him in a clearing about 200 yards, or approximately 183 meters, from the tree stand his relative had seen him sitting in the previous afternoon. He was lying on the ground, deceased. He'd been fatally shot. At first, neither James's family nor investigators had any real way of knowing that someone had shot him intentionally. So naturally, they thought that perhaps his death had been an accident, that maybe someone had stupidly mistaken him for an animal and shot him. Although they shouldn't, accidents like that do happen.
They are surprisingly common. I mean, that's why we have so many instances where deaths are related to hunting accidents.
Right. So it's natural that that's the first place their minds went. I mean, accidents like that are the whole reason that most states have rules about certain neon colors you need to wear in the woods when firearms are being used during hunting season. It's to reduce the chances of something like this.
Exactly. Now, you'd hope that being on private family land, that shouldn't occur.
Right. Now, the idea of anyone being so reckless as to shoot a person, mistaking them for an animal, as disturbing as that is, what had happened to James turned out to be even worse. When a medical examiner evaluated his wounds, they determined that he'd been shot not once, but twice, and that both shots had entered through his back and exited through his chest. What's more, he'd been in a clearing when he'd been shot, not in a bushy or wooded area. Whoever had taken his life had had a clear view of him and had fired at him twice, striking him both times. Investigators were confident there was no way that such an attack had been accidental. James had been murdered. That was easy to determine once they had the facts. The difficulty would lie in determining why and by who. James had no known enemies. By all accounts, he led a low-risk lifestyle which revolved around his family. The then sheriff of Clark County would later tell the Journal-Times, quote, "Our understanding is Mr. Southworth was a good citizen, a good father, and just an all-around good guy," end quote. So why would someone murder him? Scott, I'm sure it won't surprise you at all to know that investigators suspect that James might have climbed down out of his tree stand to confront a trespasser or trespassers, and that they might have killed him.
Yeah, that was one of the things that had been lingering in the back of my mind was the potential of somebody that had been hunting illegally on the property or trespassing, or even with it being after dark.
Right.
The thought of somebody possibly road hunting and having shot something after hours and him going to go confront them, it would be a very dangerous job. But if they're on your property right then, right there, game wardens aren't around all the time.
Yeah. Earlier, like I mentioned, a relative of his had driven by and seen him in that stand, so it sounds as if the stand was visible from a road. So he probably had a view of traffic passing by. So a situation like this is often a go-to theory when it comes to these kind of deaths, and for good reason. Deliberately trespassing hunters, aka poachers, are often aggressively entitled. If they weren't, they wouldn't trespass upon land that they have every reason to suspect or know is in use by other lawful hunters in the first place. So to go and poach on land that one knows is probably occupied and in use by the owners, that's pretty bold. There's a high risk of being caught and of being confronted. And a confrontation between two armed parties, probably with emotions running high, is not a good thing.
That, or you're talking about a very small town. Most people know each other. He probably knew who did it, and he probably thought he was pretty safe just approaching them and discussing it.
That's very possible.
And he probably never even expected it, hence being shot in the back.
Right. So is that what happened to James? Was he murdered just because he crossed paths with trespassers? It's possible, perhaps in my opinion, even likely, but it's not known for sure. One thing to note is that when James's body was located, his hunting rifle was nowhere to be found. And this, the opportunistic theft of hunting weapons, is not unheard of when it comes to cases like these. We've talked about that before.
Yeah, the Chong Mu Yang episode that we covered in depth.
Yeah, his killer stole his firearm as well. You know, if someone is willing to take someone's life for essentially no reason, why wouldn't they be willing to take the valuable weapon they were carrying as well? Now, at first, investigators from the Clark County Sheriff's Office had little in the way of leads when it came to James's case. However, eventually they received a tip that they deemed credible. On the day of James's murder, 3 men had been seen on a dead-end road in the area near where his body had later been found. All 3 men had been Asian and had been seen standing by an older silver or gray Nissan or Chevy S10 pickup truck, possibly an 80s model and possibly with a lighting color stripe running down the side of the otherwise gray or silver body. The truck's bed had been equipped with a lighting color fiberglass topper, and one of the men had reportedly been dressed in hunting attire. Investigators began searching for these men shortly after James's murder and, to the best of my knowledge, have never identified them even today. According to an article published by WSAW News, investigators believe the men may have witnessed something important, possibly without even knowing it, in relation to James's case. And because of that, they of course want to speak with them. As for whether or not they believe any of the men might have played a role in James's death, I honestly don't know. Anyway, the population of Clark County, Wisconsin is, as you'd probably expect for such a rural area in that state, Scott, overwhelmingly white. I checked census records and found that white residents make up nearly 97% of the county's population, so it may seem somewhat surprising that the 3 men cited in the area that day were of Asian descent. However, it's not as unusual as it may seem at first. Not too far from Clark County in cities like Eau Claire or the Twin Cities, there are sizable Asian American communities, particularly Hmong American communities. So it's possible that the 3 men cited that day might have been part of such a community and might have driven an hour or 2 out to Clark County to hunt that day. Hunting is a very popular pursuit among many Hmong Americans, just as it is with so many other Midwesterners.
It definitely makes sense. I know that I've traveled more than an hour to go hunting before.
Yeah, most people don't have the luxury of living on a bountiful hunting property, especially if you live in an urban or suburban area. So it'd be normal to travel to a rural county like this. As for the difficulty investigators have encountered in trying to identify those 3 men, well, there are often barriers to investigative cooperation when it comes to immigrant communities. Sometimes those barriers are simple language barriers. Other times they're more complex and stem from common cultural experiences, such as the severe mistreatment that many such immigrants may have experienced at the hands of police or hostile military officials in their original home countries. Many Hmong Americans who immigrated to the U.S. during the 70s, 80s, and 90s arrived having survived terrible events in places where Hmong people had been a violently persecuted ethnic minority. So it's not difficult to imagine that for many, such experiences may have contributed to reluctance to come forward or become willingly involved in a police investigation, even in a new country. Those kind of experiences, they linger psychologically. We're talking about a community whose immigration to the U.S. was rooted in significant governmental prosecution. Scott, eventually a name came to investigators' attention in 2004, 3 years after James's murder, and it came to their attention in a big way on the heels of a mass murder. According to an article published in the Chicago Tribune in 2005, investigators considered this mass murderer a, quote, person of interest, end quote, in James's case.
Okay.
The mass murder in question was no ordinary crime, and the details of what happened could easily fill an entire podcast episode on their own. In a nutshell, what happened was a 36-year-old Minnesota man named Chai Vang, who was a naturalized American citizen and veteran of the U.S. National Guard, trespassed onto a large plot of private property in northwestern Wisconsin to hunt. Although he would later claim to have trespassed unknowingly, he did have a known history of trespassing. According to the New York Times, he'd been cited for it 2 years before. However, I do think it's worth mentioning that he was cited for trespassing while pursuing a deer that he'd already shot, not for actually trying to shoot an animal on someone else's property. And there's a pretty big difference, at least when it comes to intent, between those two things, I think.
There is, possibly not everybody knows this, but there are certain states that have laws that require you to get permission to retrieve downed game from other people's property.
Yes.
And then in some states, you are allowed to go and pursue that game. So there's definitely a split in how even the country sees it as a whole.
Right. Hunting laws can vary significantly from state to state, and it takes some research to stay up to date on those laws and make sure that you're abiding by them when you go to a state other than your home. And he was in a state other than his own home. In any case, that's really the least of his crimes. He did have a reported history of violence, specifically of domestic violence, for which he had been previously arrested, but never convicted due to his alleged victim's unwillingness to follow through with prosecution, which is very common when it comes to crimes of domestic violence.
Incredibly common, but still a major red flag.
Right. On that day in November of 2004, Vang climbed into a tree stand and was subsequently seen and angrily confronted by people hunting nearby on the property. They had this whole big hunting party of friends and family, and they were staying in a cabin. It was a whole event. Now, at first, Vang seemed willing to leave peacefully. In fact, he apologized and began quietly walking away. But when the hunters threatened to report him to law enforcement for trespassing, he reacted violently. He ended up shooting 8 people, 6 of whom died from their gunshot wounds. All but one of the people he shot had been unarmed at the time, and he shot some of his victims in their backs as they attempted to flee. One of the victims was a 27-year-old nurse who had ridden unarmed on an ATV toward the victims and the danger in an attempt to render emergency medical aid. Her first gunshot wound didn't kill her, so Vang shot her a second, fatal time as she attempted to crawl to safety. Vang was charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder. He argued self-defense, stating that some of his victims had shouted racial slurs at him and that he had felt it was either shoot or be shot himself. A quick note here, Vang is a Hmong American man whose family had immigrated to the U.S. when he'd been a child, and all the other people involved in this incident were white. Whether the racial slurs actually occurred, I don't know. I wasn't there, obviously. Certain details of what had occurred, such as the shooting of unarmed victims, the shooting of already grievously wounded victims multiple times, undermined Vang's defense. Ultimately, he was convicted of all 6 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and then some. So, Scott, it's easy to see why this event caught investigators' interest when it occurred. Vang was someone who'd trespassed onto private land and who had shot other hunters during a confrontation over that trespassing. He'd even shot some of his victims in the back. Was it the first time he'd done such a thing, or had he perhaps done so before?
It's possible he thought he could have gotten away with it because he'd done so before.
It's possible, and, it would be a natural question for investigators to ask in such a situation. But, Scott, to the best of my knowledge, no evidence has emerged linking Vang to James's death. Yes, he committed a crime similar to the one committed against James, but that doesn't mean that he was involved in James's death. James's killer could have been someone else, perhaps another trespasser. While the crimes for which Vang was convicted may be shocking, he is not the only person known to have killed other hunters in the midst of trespassing confrontations. There are other offenders like him, unfortunately. In fact, in 3 of the 4 cases included in this episode alone, it's considered possible that the homicide victims were killed by trespassers. James's death might not have had anything at all to do with the shocking 2004 mass murder. The Chicago Tribune article stating that investigators considered Vang a person of interest is more than 20 years old, and I don't know whether investigators consider him to be a person of interest anymore. There's very little in the way of recent reporting on James's case, so investigators' current theories and thoughts are not publicly known. Either way, more than 20 years after the fact, James's murder remains unsolved. His family was devastated by his needless death. This was especially true for his wife, Janice, who was left to raise their 2 young children alone. They were so young when he was murdered, at just 4 and 7 years old, that they would be left with only limited memories of their devoted dad. Janice and the rest of James's loved ones are still waiting for answers. According to a recent WSAW news article, there is a $50,000 award available, courtesy of James's family and friends, for information leading to the arrest and conviction of those responsible for his death. If you know anything about the death of James Southworth, please contact the Clark County Sheriff's Department at 1-800-743-2420. And now, on to our next story after a short break. Steve Kachanik was last seen alive on November 12, 2005. He was 39 years old at the time and lived in New Alexandria, Pennsylvania. New Alexandria is a small borough home to just a few hundred people located in the western part of the state. Steve had lived there his entire life, with the exception of when his service in the U.S. Army had taken him elsewhere. After his military career concluded, he'd returned to New Alexandria, where he worked for a construction company his brother owned, and was a father to 2 young children, an 8-year-old son and 10-year-old daughter. For someone like Steve, whose hobbies all revolved around enjoying the outdoors, New Alexandria was an excellent place to call home. The area is heavily forested, and there's a state park, Keystone State Park, on the borough's outskirts. Steve loved to garden, to forage for mushrooms, and, like so many other citizens of rural western Pennsylvania, to hunt. Specifically, he loved archery hunting. According to his ex-wife and the mother of his children, Amy, Steve spent virtually all of his time on 3 things: his family, especially their kids, work, and the outdoors. So when the height of deer hunting season rolled around in mid-November, Steve could, naturally, often be found out in the woods. He was part of a very large family. He had 7 siblings and a lot of relatives in the area. Collectively, they owned about 40 acres, or approximately 16 hectares of land a little ways outside of town, about 15 minutes from Steve's house. And that was where Steve, along with other members of his family, frequently hunted. Steve had been hunting that land since age 12, so he knew it very well. And Steve truly loved it there. In fact, he loved that land so much that his dad had given him 3 acres to build a home on so he could live there. At the time of his death, construction on the house was underway, and Steve was really excited about it, as were his kids. They could not wait to live there at this place that to them and their family was so special. Generally, that land was a place where Steve and his family members felt safe. Here's what Steve's dad, Andrew, told a journalist for TribLive.com, quote, "There is no public hunting within a mile of that area. We all go hunting out there, and we all feel safe because it's all private property, and we know who's supposed to be out there hunting. I always felt very safe out there, and I still do," end quote. But at the time, for some inexplicable reason, it wasn't safe, at least not for Steve. In an interview with the Valley News Dispatch, Steve's dad reflected upon the events that occurred that November, stating that someone, he doesn't know who, had been after his son for some time. The first sign of this that we know of occurred 4 months prior to Steve's death during the summer. During that time of year, Steve enjoyed riding his ATV on a path that went through the property specifically for that purpose. It gave him a way to enjoy the outdoors when hunting wasn't in season. One day in July, Steve was riding an ATV down that path like he always did when he noticed something that wasn't right. It was difficult to actually see, but it was enough to make him stop his ATV and investigate. And it was a good thing he did, because had he not, he could have been decapitated. Someone had strung a steel cable across the ATV path at head level.
Not the first time I've heard of this.
Sadly, according to what Steve's dad told the Valley News Dispatch, someone had even gone so far as to paint the cable in a camouflage pattern so that it would be difficult to see.
When you first said that somebody was after his son, I was questioning, like, how did we get to that point? What was the evidence around that? But
this is the evidence.
But now it's blatantly obvious. That was not an understatement.
Scott, as I'm sure you well know, a stunt like this is not a prank or joke. It's nothing short of attempted murder. And this person had taken it really far. They'd even painted it camouflage. They really thought, I think, that Steve was going to run into this and be killed or seriously injured. So whoever put that cable there meant serious harm to someone.
Absolutely.
So that was the first attempt on Steve's life. By some tremendous stroke of luck, he managed to avoid the trap. 4 months later, though, he was deceased. Steve's family realized something was wrong when he didn't come home from his hunt on November 12th. He'd headed out at about 3 p.m. and had waved to his dad on his way to his tree stand. Looking back now, his dad believes Steve looked stressed when he waved at him, as if something had perhaps been wrong. What that something was, and whether it had anything to do with Steve's death, he only wishes he knew. In any case, when Steve failed to return home that evening, his family launched a search. That was at about 5:30 p.m. When they didn't find him within a couple hours, they called for professional help. By 9 p.m., the Pennsylvania State Police joined in, as did local firefighters. The state police even used a helicopter equipped with infrared imaging technology. Even so, it wasn't until the following morning at about 7:20 a.m. that they found Steve.
We've talked about thermal imaging and helicopters equipped with that in the past episodes, and we've always said how it's very time critical as far as when it gets deployed.
Yes, there's a window of opportunity that you have to use it during.
This really emphasizes how critical it is to have it out there early.
Yes, his family did the right thing by calling for professional help quickly. It was only a couple hours of searching when they decided, hey, we really need to get the police in here. But the thermal imaging technology, like you said, it only works on a body that's warm. So a person who's living or recently deceased, if their body has had a chance to cool, it's not going to show up. In any case, that morning they found Steve lying under a portable tree stand he'd positioned in a tree not on his family's 40 acres, but right next door on some adjacent farmland. Now, to be clear, Steve had permission from the landowner to hunt there, and he'd been doing so for years. He was not trespassing or poaching in any capacity. If anything, he was helping that farmer protect his crops.
Yeah, that makes complete and total sense to me.
When searchers found Steve, it was clear that he was deceased. At first, they figured he'd fallen out of his tree stand. That happens. People are seriously injured or killed falling out of those things, and a fall from a height of somewhere in the range of 15 to 20 feet, or about 4.5 to 6 meters, can be deadly. So if he had died that way, he would not be the first hunter to do so. However, an accidental fall had not been what had killed him. It turned out that he'd been shot out of the tree stand. A medical examiner determined that a 12-gauge shotgun blast to the chest had knocked him out of the tree, and that whoever had fired the shotgun had done so from a close range. Now, when he was shot, Steve, an avid archer, had not been armed with a gun of his own, only a bow. Whoever killed Steve walked up to him and did so in cold blood. 19 years later, investigators are still working to determine who that someone was. His parents believe that his killer was someone he knew. According to what they told the Valley News-Dispatch, there's no public hunting within a mile of where Steve was killed, and appearances by strangers are few and far between in those woods. Statistically speaking, Steve's parents are probably right. Most murder victims are killed by people they know. Plus, the rural community where Steve lived and died was small. Many people in the area know each other to some degree. Why anyone would want to take Steve's life is unknown. We don't know for sure whether his killer was the same person who endangered his life by stringing that steel cable across an ATV path a few months before, but Scott, I'd bet that the odds are pretty strong. Now, in an interview with WPXI News, Pennsylvania State Police Officer Steve Lamani cautioned the public, saying, quote, "We have a killer on the loose. We have somebody that killed somebody and has not been brought to justice," end quote. As far as anyone knows, Steve's murderer is still out there. They could potentially hurt someone else, could potentially devastate another family. There's a distinct tear in the fabric of Steve's large family, a place where he should be. His dad keeps the shotgun pellets that were mined from his body in a bag, holding on to them as he holds on to hope that his son's killer will finally be identified and brought to justice. As for the 3 acres of family land where Steve had been building a home, his former wife, Amy, told the Valley News-Dispatch the following, quote, "It was horrible. Steve was in the middle of building a house, and the kids were looking forward to living there. And now when we drive up to visit Steve's parents, they can hardly stand to look at it," end quote. She also told the Valley News-Dispatch that breaking the news of their dad's death to the kids was the most heart-wrenching thing she's ever had to do. For a while, she maintained an informational website, WeMissOurDaddy.com, in hopes of spreading the word about Steve's case and encouraging tips. On the site, she wrote, quote, "The worst thing I have ever had to do in my life was to tell our children that their daddy had an accident and died. Steve was laid to rest the day before his daughter's birthday. Please don't let this happen to someone else's daughter," end quote. And although they were no longer a couple, Steve's death was, of course, devastating for Amy too on a personal level, as she explained to the Valley News-Dispatch. Quote, "We were neighbors when we were young, and I knew him my whole life. He was a very hard worker and just great with our 2 children," end quote. Steve's death also tore him away from his current partner at the time, Marcy, and, of course, from his parents, many siblings, nieces, and nephews. It was a loss none of them had had any reason to see coming. Why would anyone stalk Steve through the woods and murder him, ending his life at just 39 and depriving his young children of a father? Investigators are still trying to answer that question, and they need the public's help. Pennsylvania State Police Officer Lamani told WPXI News that during the years since Steve's death, his killer may have confided in someone. And Scott, he's probably right. Murderers often have trouble keeping their mouths shut. We know that. The odds are strong that there's someone, very possibly multiple someones, who know exactly who's responsible for Steve's death. Investigators hope that person will come forward. If you know anything about the death of Steve Kachanik, please call the Pennsylvania Crime Stoppers toll-free at 1-800-4PA-TIPS, or submit a tip through their online tip form, which we've linked to in the show notes and on our website. Either way, you can remain anonymous if you wish, and if your tip moves the case forward, you may be eligible for a cash reward. And now, on to our next story after a short break. Terrence Brisk, who went by Terry, was last seen alive on November 7th, 2016. He was 41 years old at the time and lived in Belle Prairie Township, Minnesota, with his wife Pam and their 4 kids, 3 sons and a daughter ranging in age from 7 to 15. Terry had grown up in Belle Prairie Township, working hard in his family's road construction business in his younger years. By the time of his death, he was a skilled diesel mechanic and worked for a heavy equipment dealer. He'd always been mechanically minded, so the job was a natural fit. To his friends and family, Terry was the go-to guy for any kind of mechanical problem. There was almost nothing he couldn't figure out or fix. Chances are that many listeners, especially rural Midwesterners, know someone a lot like Terry, a hardworking guy who continued to call the rural area he'd grown up in home, who spent most of his free time with his family, who never hesitated to help his elderly parents out with anything they needed, and who looked forward to deer hunting season each fall. By November 7th, deer season had been underway for well over a month, but only for hunting with archery tackle. The firearms deer season had just opened, which was a big deal. Using a firearm allows a hunter the opportunity to harvest an animal from a much greater distance than a bow. Plus, it typically corresponds with the rut, or deer mating season, which means that the largest, most mature animals are out and about. Many hunters consider it the highlight of the season, and Terry was no exception. So that 7th was a Monday, and normally Terry would have spent it working. However, when he woke up that morning, the temperature was uncharacteristically mild for November in Minnesota, and the forecast promised ideal hunting conditions. So Terry could not resist. He took the day off work and set off into the woods instead. Now, he was still pretty tired from the night before, much of which he'd spent tracking and attempting to locate a deer that his wife, Pam, had shot. But the weather was just too good to pass up on. So he went out anyway, and the area he chose to hunt in that day was located on a 40-acre, or 16-hectare approximately, piece of land that his parents owned. Much of the land was wooded, and he'd identified a specific spot that he wanted to hunt from. He spent the day in the woods. Meanwhile, with it being a Monday, his 4 kids were all in school. However, that afternoon, after school let out for the day, his oldest son, 15-year-old Jonathan, was eager to set out into the woods, just like his dad had. The day's prime evening hunting hours were yet to come, so when Jonathan got off the bus, he sprinted inside the house to change into his hunting clothes. His grandparents, who lived nearby, were visiting with his mom, but she agreed to interrupt the visit long enough to drive him down to the area where Terry was hunting and drop him off. It was less than a mile away, just about 1.5 kilometers down the road. According to an article by Chelsea Perkins published on TwinCities.com, the first thing Jonathan did was to make his way to a ground blind and settle in. He wasn't sure exactly where his dad was on the property, so he texted him to let him know where he was sitting. And he did this in order to ensure that they wouldn't end up accidentally aiming at the same deer from different vantage points, creating a potentially dangerous situation.
Beyond that, it also provides safety for you because you know that no matter where he is, he's going to know not to shoot in that direction of that stand.
Right. Now, to Jonathan's surprise, when he texted his dad, he could hear the notification sound his dad's phone made. At first, he thought maybe his dad had seen him arrive and was carefully walking towards him, being really quiet so as not to alarm any animals. But as Jonathan continued to send texts, the notification sounds grew neither louder nor quieter, and there was no sign of his dad approaching. So Jonathan emerged from the blind and looked around. Seeing nothing, he turned and prepared to re-enter the blind, and that's when he finally saw his dad. Terry was lying on the ground just a short distance from the blind, and it was obvious that he was deceased. The blood present suggested that he'd been shot, and as Jonathan tried to make sense of what he was seeing, he thought that his dad must have been involved in some kind of hunting accident, like had someone accidentally shot him? Had he accidentally shot himself? That article by journalist Chelsea Perkins mentions that Jonathan considered the possibility that his dad's rifle might have gotten snagged by a tree branch as he'd walked through the woods, that perhaps a tree branch had gotten caught in the trigger guard and caused the rifle to fire with fatal consequences, or something like that. In that moment, that idea made as much or more sense than anything else. Shocked more than he ever had been, and perhaps ever would be in his entire life, Jonathan did the first thing that came to mind, called his mom. She immediately dialed 911, and officers from the local sheriff's office responded to the scene. Terry's family, his wife Pam, and his parents, who had recently stopped by to visit, weren't far behind. Upon arrival, deputies quickly noticed something that Jonathan had been too stunned to even register. There was no sign of Terry's hunting rifle. Terry had been fatally shot, but there was no gun in sight. Deputies questioned Jonathan at the scene and collected his clothes, which were visibly bloody. However, testing would reveal that Jonathan had been telling the truth when he'd told them that the blood was from a deer he'd harvested 2 days before. None of it was human. Deputies also collected Jonathan's hunting rifle, but their investigation would reveal that it wasn't the weapon Terry had been shot with. Investigators believed Terry's own gun, the missing Winchester AE 3030 lever-action rifle, was likely the murder weapon. Scott, to me, the fact that Terry is believed to have been killed with his own rifle is perhaps the most unusual part of this case.
It is rather shocking, and it's very difficult to try to come up with a way to explain that.
Right. It means basically two things. One, that Terry's killer was able to get close enough to him to physically take his rifle and shoot him with it, and two, that Terry's killer had either been unarmed when they'd encountered him, or if they had been armed, had made the strange and risky decision to take Terry's weapon from him and shoot him with that rather than their own weapon. Naturally, investigators did search the area surrounding the crime scene thoroughly for any sign of the missing rifle. However, it was nowhere to be found, at least not for a long while. We'll get to its eventual discovery here shortly. Meanwhile, Scott, whenever I hear about a hunter becoming a homicide victim, I immediately wonder whether they were killed by another hunter, perhaps a poacher. In either case, the killer would be armed themselves, right? So why try to pull off something as risky as taking a gun from another armed person? As we've discussed before in our episodes on the homicide of Chong Ma Yang and the disappearance of Eric Smith, both hunters, when it comes to the woods, other people are often the most serious threat. Hunters are a lot more likely to be shot, whether intentionally or accidentally, by another human than they are to be attacked by, say, a bear. During those episodes, we also discussed the poaching problem that many private landowners face. There's a small but dangerous fraction of hunters who are unrepentant poachers. Broadly speaking, a poacher is someone who hunts animals outside of the bounds of the law, but in relation to this case specifically, I'm referring to people who trespass on land they don't have a legal right to hunt. These poachers can be a serious problem because poaching is truly hazardous. It's important that people hunting in close proximity to one another, especially with firearms, know where other hunters are for safety reasons. Obviously, it's typically impossible to know where, when, or even whether a trespasser is sneaking around. Nonetheless, there are people who do this all the time, and frankly, they don't care about the safety of others at all. If they had anything less than a total disregard for the lives and physical safety of other people, they wouldn't poach in the first place, especially not on relatively small and actively hunted plots of land that are bound to be in use by other lawful hunters during rifle season. So, was Terry victimized by one or more of these people? Did he perhaps confront a poacher, and did they shoot him in retaliation? It's a possibility that investigators have considered, even though they believe Terry was killed with his own weapon. And in fact, trespassers were a known continuous problem on the land Terry had been hunting. Not all of those trespassers were poachers, though. There was more than just wild game that drew trespassers to the property. Like I mentioned, Scott, the property in question belonged to Terry's parents, who own a road construction company. On the property, they had a large gravel pit. Now, a gravel pit might not sound particularly alluring to the average person, but during the course of my research into this episode, I learned that some people find such pits pretty irresistible. According to articles like that one by journalist Chelsea Perkins, people frequently trespassed on the property in order to go rock picking. And what they were looking for was agate. You know, those cool rocks with the wavy layers that look sort of like psychedelic quartz?
I do.
They are a semi-precious stone, and apparently gravel pits are known to contain such hidden gems, which can be found if someone is willing to pick through them.
I could see it being a fun pastime, but I can't see the reason to go trespassing for it.
Right, same. So it was a problem on the property, even though the road leading back to the gravel pit was private and guarded with a locked gate. People would often come onto the property on foot, and Terry was known to run trespassers off when he encountered them, because trespassers weren't just an annoyance, they were a legal liability. As Terry's eldest son, Jonathan, explained to journalist Chelsea Perkins, his dad routinely kicked trespassers off the property for fear that they would hurt themselves in the gravel pit and sue his parents, the property owners.
That's a very valid concern.
It is. If I owned a big gravel pit full of treasures, I wouldn't want random strangers going in there with hammers and doing whatever they do. Jonathan also mentioned that they had had people trespass onto the property to steal deer hunting equipment like tree stands before, too. So, Terry being killed by a trespasser is one possibility which the Morrison County Sheriff's Office has not discounted. In an article by John Lauritsen for CBS News, the Morrison County Sheriff is quoted saying that if a trespasser killed Terry, they probably took him by surprise somehow. Another disturbing possibility investigators have considered is that Terry's killer might have been someone he knew, someone who was able to get close to him without arousing any alarm and get their hands on his weapon. There would be no need for such a person to take Terry by surprise, not if they were someone he knew and trusted.
That's the more concerning of all of the theories.
Right. The question, of course, is who would do such a thing? In an interview with journalist Ellery McCardle for KARE 11 News, Terry's mom, Babe Brisk, stated that she believes her son's killer was someone he knew. In another article, she mentioned that she has some suspicions as to who that someone might be, but without any evidence won't publicly name them. As for whether or not investigators have identified any specific suspect or suspects by name, I don't know for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised, because the Morrison County Sheriff's Office has been working hard on this case, which, by the way, they say is definitely not cold. Now, the Morrison County Sheriff's Office is a rural agency that rarely deals with homicides. Because of that, the Morrison County Sheriff, Sheriff Larson, sought outside expertise immediately at the beginning of the investigation. Specifically, he reached out to state authorities as well as the FBI. So this is not one of those cases where justice has been stymied by ego or unwillingness to ask for more resources. It really sounds like the sheriff has done everything right and is truly invested in bringing Terry's killer to justice. For the past 7 years, Sheriff Larson has headed what he's described as a, quote, slow, methodical investigation, end quote. Investigators have doggedly sought out and questioned anyone who might have relevant information, nearby landowners, hunters who frequent the area, etc. And Scott, I don't know about you, but when I learned about this case, one of the first things I wondered was, did investigators utilize geofencing? That is, did they determine what phones were in the area at the time of the homicide? Because that could absolutely be key to solving this case, just as it was in Chong Mua Yang's case. He was also murdered while hunting, and cell phone location data was critical when it came to identifying and charging suspects.
I'm sure they have, just because of how critical it is, and in more rural areas, you're going to have a lot less hits.
Right. I'm happy to say that you're correct. Investigators have examined relevant cell phone data during the course of this investigation. In fact, according to that article by Chelsea Perkins for TwinCities.com, by reviewing cell phone data, investigators were able to identify multiple repeat offenders who'd been trespassing on the property. Investigators have questioned those trespassers, and while some have alibis for the day of the murder, others don't, and therefore remain potential suspects. And there have been other developments in the investigation as well. For starters, Scott, you know Terry's missing rifle, the murder weapon?
Yes.
Well, in 2017, the year following Terry's death, investigators actually found it. Now, I can't tell you where investigators found the murder weapon because they haven't publicly revealed that information. They're keeping it quiet for the sake of the investigation. However, they have it in their possession now and still believe that it is the murder weapon. Also, investigators have identified a vehicle of interest to the investigation, a blue minivan that they say was in the area where Terry was hunting on the day of his death. They're looking for any information related to such a van and have asked the public to reach out if they know anything about a vehicle matching that description that may have been in the area on that day. Investigators are still working diligently to determine who killed Terry, leaving his 4 children without their dad, his wife without her husband, nieces and nephews without an uncle, and his elderly parents without their son. Here's what investigators have pieced together so far, according to Sheriff Larson. Quote, "We believe that there was probably some interaction between Terry and the suspect. We believe that Terry saw this person clearly, and there was probably a conversation that took place prior. The evidence points that this was close proximity, and this was close and personal." End quote. Sheriff Larson has also said that whoever killed Terry may have displayed abrupt changes in behavior after the murder, which is common for killers. Such changes could include things like increased nervousness or irritability, increased alcohol or drug use, missing work or leaving town, whether temporarily or permanently. Sheriff Larson has asked locals to be mindful of this and to report any tips. If you know anything about the death of Terry Brisk, please contact the Morrison County Sheriff's Office at 320-632-9233. Or, if you prefer to remain anonymous, you can contact Minnesota Crime Stoppers at 1-800-233-8477 or via their website, crimestoppersmn.org. If you'd like, you can even text Minnesota Crime Stoppers by sending a text message beginning with TIP 674, that's tip 674, to the number 274-637. No matter how you report your tip, if it leads to the arrest and conviction of a suspect in regard to Terry's homicide, you could be eligible for a $30,000 reward. And now, onto our final story after a short break. This case was suggested to us by Jeremiah, who's a Last Seen Alive listener. Thanks, Jeremiah, for bringing Steve's case to our attention. We appreciate it. Steve Keel was last seen alive on August 27, 2022. He was 61 years old at the time and lived in Dover, Tennessee. Dover is a small town in the northwestern part of the state just south of the Kentucky border. However, that's not where this story takes place. Steve was a Marine Corps veteran, professional electrician, husband, and father of 3 adult children. You might think of someone tough when you think of a Marine, and everyone who knew Steve agrees that he was a tough guy, but that wasn't all there was to Steve. In fact, his nickname was Smiley. And judging by the photos of Steve, I was able to locate where he often has a big smile on his face. I don't think that was an ironic nickname. Like all of the people featured in this episode, Steve loved the outdoors, especially hunting. And while there are certainly plenty of hunting opportunities to be had in rural Tennessee, occasionally Steve and a friend of his would go on these out-of-state hunting trips where they could traverse vastly different wildernesses in pursuit of game that they didn't have at home. So something totally new for them.
I can definitely see the appeal to that.
Yeah, it was a big adventure for them, something very different than what they had at home. So Steve's hunting buddy was a fellow Dover resident named Brian. Together, they'd gone on several hunting trips to Colorado and Wyoming. Each time, they'd found new challenges, memories, and experiences well worth the journey and expense, they felt. In August of 2022, they geared up for their greatest adventure yet, Alaska.
Certainly a different territory than Tennessee.
Extremely. Now, neither of them had ever been anywhere in Alaska before, and both were incredibly excited to experience the state's famously rugged beauty for themselves. They planned a long-distance caribou hunt in a wilderness area near the community of Dead Horse. Dead Horse is located in northernmost Alaska, not far from the Sag River. For that matter, the Arctic Ocean, specifically Prudhoe Bay, isn't too far away either. Scott, if you're envisioning a rugged, remote Arctic tundra, you've got it right.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like Arctic Circle up there. A lot of ice, a lot of snow.
Yes, it is Arctic. Dead Horse is about 500 miles or 804 kilometers north of the city of Fairbanks, which you've probably heard of, and it's home to less than 50 permanent residents. At any given time, you might also find up to a couple thousand temporary residents, most of whom are employed by oil or pipeline companies. So that's most of the people who you'll find in this area as workers up there extracting minerals.
Okay.
This rugged area experiences the midnight sun as well as its counterpart, polar night. Even in August, temperatures routinely dip into the 30s Fahrenheit, hovering just above freezing at night. However, these Arctic phenomena and resource extraction aren't all the area is known for. There's also abundant wildlife, as you can probably imagine for a place with such a small human population.
I think it's really delving into their territory more than us civilizing the area.
Absolutely. I think humans in this area are just visitors. This is a very rugged, wild area. Now, in particular, there are large caribou herds that frequent the tundra, and those are what drew Steve and Brian to the isolated wilderness outside of Dead Horse. Initially, they landed in Fairbanks, rented a van, loaded up their hunting gear, and hit the Dalton Highway, which has been made famous by TV shows such as Ice Road Truckers and World's Most Dangerous Roads. Via the Dalton Highway, they made the 500-mile or 804-kilometer drive north to the Dead Horse area. And when they finally arrived, they parked the van, strapped on their gear, and began a long hike in search of the caribou herds.
So I take it wasn't like a guided hunt either.
No, they had no guide. They were totally on their own. Now, back home in Tennessee, Steve's wife, Liz, knew that Steve and Brian were in an extremely remote area. They'd gone on long hunting trips before. It was something she was accustomed to. She had confidence in her husband's outdoor savviness, and while she couldn't help but worry a little, ultimately she trusted that he'd return safely within a couple weeks, probably with some fantastic stories to tell. He always had before, but this time proved different. 11 days into the trip, Liz received alarming news. Up until then, she'd received regular, brief updates from Steve's hunting partner, Brian, who had a satellite phone that he took along on all of their trips. Steve wasn't particularly interested in tech, so Brian handled sending messages back to their families during these hunts just to let them know that they were okay. On August 27th, however, Brian used his satellite phone for a different purpose, to send an emergency request for assistance to local authorities. His hunting partner, Steve, was inexplicably missing.
That seems more than just a little bit strange.
Well, it was pretty strange, and here's what happened. Steve and Brian had established a base camp, as well as various hunting spots that they would hike out to from the base camp. By the 27th, both Steve and Brian had managed to harvest a caribou. That day, they hiked from one of their hunting spots back to base camp, and Steve was carrying a large amount of caribou meat in his backpack. It was really heavy. These are very large animals, so eventually it became too heavy to continue hiking with. So Steve set it down on the ground and planned to return for it the next day, the 28th. It was apparently cold enough that the meat could sit out in the open without spoiling. I would imagine, though, that the meat might attract animals such as bear or wolves. However, I don't know whether he took any precautions to safeguard the meat against them. I only know that he left the backpack there and that the place where he left it was 3/4 of a mile or about 1.2 kilometers from their base camp. A quick side note here. The most recent articles I could find on this case say that Steve left his backpack 3/4 of a mile away because he wasn't able to carry it any farther. Some other articles say that Steve and Brian were storing their meat a half-mile away from their base camp anyway in order to avoid attracting bear to their camp. But whatever the reason for Steve leaving the meat where he did, the bottom line is he left it behind and planned to return for it the following day.
That definitely makes sense. You're out in the wilderness. You don't want to have all this lucrative free meat for an Alaskan brown bear.
You would not catch me anywhere on the Alaskan tundra with a backpack full of meat. No way. You would definitely want to store it away from where you're sleeping. Now, when Steve and Brian got back to the base camp, they ate dinner and went to bed. When they awoke the next morning, Steve felt refreshed and set out to retrieve his backpack full of caribou meat. Some sources say he was just going to cut some off of it, like maybe they were going to eat it. I'm not sure which is the case. Either way, he walked out to the backpack with the intent of retrieving at least some of the meat. Now, he left it less than a mile away from base camp, so he felt confident making the hike himself, and he told Brian he'd be right back. Only he never returned. When Brian realized that Steve had been gone longer than he should have been, he hiked out after him. One article from News Channel 5 Nashville states that Steve never made it to the caribou meat, so I assume from that Brian was able to find Steve's backpack and that it appeared to be untouched. However, he wasn't able to find Steve despite searching for him for 24 hours straight. At the end of those 24 hours, Brian knew he was out of his depth. Yes, he and Steve sometimes did separate for up to a day at a time during their hunts. However, Steve hadn't indicated that he'd intended to do anything other than go retrieve the meat he'd left behind. And for that matter, he apparently hadn't even made it to the meat. And he hadn't been at any of the hunting spots they'd established he'd checked. It was time to call for help. Brian used his satellite phone to send an SOS signal to authorities in the area. Doing so prompted a significant and very expensive response. Invoking that kind of help wasn't a choice that Brian made lightly, but he realized his friend was likely in real danger. There was no other real option. In response, Alaskan authorities launched plane and helicopter searches. Trying to locate Steve visually was like looking for a needle in a haystack since he'd been wearing all camouflage clothing. However, they had infrared technology that allowed them to search for the heat signature given by a human body against the comparatively cold Earth. Of course, as we've already mentioned in other segments, that kind of technology is only useful if a body is warm. A body begins to cool immediately upon death, and in an Arctic environment, it would cool rapidly.
Not to mention, they're probably in some pretty insulating clothing that's going to trap the heat inside, and while the outer layers cool down relatively quickly, comparatively speaking.
I would hope so. So, if Steve was deceased, it's possible that aerial searches could have overlooked him, even with infrared on their side. During the course of these aerial searches, authorities expended hundreds of thousands of dollars, much of which went to fueling the planes and helicopters. Despite this, no trace of Steve could be detected from the sky. Meanwhile, Steve's two sons searched for him on the ground. They'd flown to Alaska as soon as they'd learned their dad was missing and had made the long journey up to Dead Horse. Together, they combed through their dad's base camp, the area where he'd left his backpack, and around a nearby lake. Like authorities, despite their best efforts, they couldn't find any indicators of where their dad had gone. What happened to Steve remains unknown. In an early article published by News Channel 5 Nashville, it stated that authorities hadn't ruled out any explanation, including that of foul play. Whether or not that remains the case, I frankly don't know. Scott, Steve was in an extremely remote area, and the odds of him encountering any other person besides Brian were probably pretty slim. As for Brian, WSMV4 News did ask him bluntly whether he had anything to do with Steve's disappearance, and he told them absolutely not, that he loved Steve like a brother. He also noted that ever since Steve's disappearance, he'd been haunted by the thought that maybe everything would be different if he'd just gone along with Steve to retrieve the backpack. WSMV4 News also asked Brian why he'd waited 24 hours to report Steve missing. Brian told them that he and Steve had always abided by an agreed-upon 24-hour contingency plan during their long-distance hunts. He stated, quote, "When you are hunting, we would separate for a day at a time several times. The last thing you want to do is get everyone out looking for you when you're fine. That's always been our plan. Give us a day." End quote. Of course, Scott, on the remote Arctic tundra, one is probably more likely to encounter natural dangers than to fall victim to foul play. The wilderness there is rugged and dangerous in a way that many of us in the lower 48 can't quite imagine. Like, Scott, our mountainous climate, it might as well be a balmy resort island compared to northernmost Alaska.
So, on top of just the climate and the temperatures and how rugged the terrain is, all of the animals there are much larger and far more dangerous also.
Yes. Unlike back home in Tennessee, where the largest carnivores are mostly divine black bears, the Dead Horse area is home to supersized and potentially dangerous wildlife. I did a little research, and both grizzly and polar bears inhabit this part of Alaska. And of course, those are widely considered to be the most dangerous bear species.
I'm no Dwight Schrute, but neither one of them would I want to meet.
No.
Especially a polar bear in that area, it's going to blend in so well. You may be being stalked without ever even knowing.
Well, on that note, the polar bears are present in that area in the largest numbers during August and September, so exactly when Steve and Brian made their trip. Bears and wolves, of course, follow the caribou herds, which are a significant food source for them as they migrate. However, authorities say they weren't able to locate any evidence of a bear attack or any kind of animal attack. And make no mistake, bear attacks are violent and messy. Fortunately, that's not what authorities believe happened to Steve. So, if not an animal attack, what happened? Well, in Arctic Alaska, predators are far from the only natural peril. There's lots of water in the wilderness surrounding Dead Horse. If you look at a map, you'll see that the landscape is dappled with lakes, big and small. They're all over the place. However, water hazards are hardly all there is to be cautious around. Scott, it's all of our childhood nightmares come true. It's actually true in this area. The terrain apparently has sinkholes and quicksand all over the place. That's according to News Channel 5 Nashville.
The minute you said our childhood fears, I knew you were going to say quicksand, and I'm going to be 100% honest. It had never crossed my mind, and I'm terrified of going to that area now, and I don't think I will.
I was very surprised when I read it. I also had no idea. I don't know if Steve knew when he went out there. Now, Scott, it certainly seems possible to me that Steve could have succumbed to any of a variety of natural dangers. I know he was an experienced outdoorsman, but he wasn't an experienced Alaskan outdoorsman, and there's a big difference.
Yeah, and like I mentioned earlier, they didn't have a guide. They weren't with somebody that knew where these hazards may or may not be or what the warning signs are.
Right.
And even if they were, I'm not sure that would have changed necessarily any of the perils that he may have succumbed to.
Right. He'd never been to the state before at all, and he was in one of the most remote corners that it had to offer in the Arctic, literally, and he didn't have a guide. Still, the fact remains that most hunters who venture to Alaska's northern slope make it home safe, even if they're not from that part of the world. And Steve, wherever he is an unfortunate outlier. Since the initial searches for Steve, there have been others. For example, his family organized searches on foot. Volunteers came to help, some from incredibly far away. And then, in 2023, about a year after Steve's disappearance, it seemed as if answers had finally been found. Using sonar technology, a search team located what they believed to be human remains at the bottom of a lake. Ultimately, though, the remains turned out not to be human. Steve's family is still actively searching for him when they're able and hopes to locate his remains and bring them home to Tennessee. They say that's where he'd want to be. His wife, Liz, told KTUU News, quote, "We just want to bring him home. There's nothing in it for us except to bring him home where he belongs," end quote. The long and harsh winters on the northern slope pose a significant obstacle to their search efforts. Searches can only be conducted during the warmer months. Still, the Keel family won't rest until they bring Steve home. Now, I realize we're talking about a very remote area and that most listeners won't find themselves in the Alaskan Arctic anytime soon, if ever. But if you happen to be someone who finds themselves there, maybe you're a hunter and plan to pursue the caribou there like Steve, please keep an eye out for any sign of him, and if you find anything, report it. Being able to bring him home would mean the world to his family. Also, if you are heading up to Alaska's northern slope, be sure to be careful yourself and stay safe out there. If you have any information on the disappearance of Steve Keel, please contact the North Slope Borough Police Department at 907-852-2611.
My final thoughts wrapping up are the same ones that I have every time we do a case on a missing hunter. And that's, if you're heading out into the woods, be extra careful, be extra cautious, and be extra vigilant, because there are a number of missing people in the woods and you might find something. Hunters are often the ones that find something that could lead to any of these cases being resolved. As always, just be extra vigilant.
This concludes our special multi-case episode on missing and murdered hunters. If these cases are of special interest to you, you may want to check out our other episodes on missing hunters. We aired an episode on the disappearance of Virginia hunter Eric Smith in July of 2022, and an episode on murdered Texas hunter Dr. George Cronus in August of 2021. You can scroll back in our feed to those dates to listen if you'd like.
That's all for this special multi-case episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening. Make sure you check out our website, lastseenalivepodcast.com, for photos from the story and links to the sources we used to write it. While you're at it, follow us on Insta and Twitter at LSA Podcast or on TikTok at Last Seen Alive Podcast. New episodes of Last Seen Alive go live every other Monday. See you then. If you think bringing unsolved cases like these to the public's attention is important, please take a moment to rate or review Last Seen Alive and tell your friends to check us out too. We'd really appreciate it. Also, don't forget to check out our new merch store where you can get an LSA t-shirt or hoodie. We donate 50% of the proceeds from every sale to the DNA Dope Project. Last Seen Alive is written and researched by you, Leah. Audio engineering and editing is provided by me, Scott.